Living alone in a new apartment building was daunting at first, but I quickly got used to the new routine. I'd only ever lived with my parents in their suburban house, so this was a very different experience. I would come home, check the mail, and usually find a package or two waiting for me. That is, until the mail started disappearing. At first, I brushed it off as a mix-up with the delivery service, but then a pattern started to emerge. Packages were going missing even when I was at home, but this unease soon turned into full-blown fear when I began noticing strange noises at night. Footsteps, whispers, and rustling sounds that came from the hallway outside my door. At the time, I told myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew that something wasn't right. Eventually, I decided to install a camera outside my door to see if I could catch the culprit. I didn't know what to expect exactly, but secretly, I think I was hoping that it was all just my imagination. But what I saw on the footage made my blood run cold. There was a shadowy figure that appeared every single night at exactly 2:35 a.m. in front of my apartment door. It was never quite close enough to make out a face or identity, but then, one night, I decided to watch the camera footage live to see if it returned, and I was horrified to see that the figure was now closer to my door than it had ever been before. I could see its eyes gleaming in the darkness, staring straight at the camera. It was as if it knew that I was watching. The figure moved closer and closer until it was right outside my door. I held my breath, not daring to move. But then I heard a soft knock. With my heart pounding, I slowly approached my front door and peered through the peephole. It became clear that the figure was actually a rough-looking middle-aged man. He looked like he hadn't bathed in weeks, and his eyes were sunken and deranged. As I stood there staring at him through the peephole, suddenly my phone started ringing. The man noticed the sound, and almost immediately, a sinister grin emerged on his face, displaying his black, decayed teeth. He started scratching at the door, and I almost fainted out of fear. I called the police right away, and begged them to send over a car, as there was a dangerous man outside my door. I wanted to scream at him and tell him to leave, but I was so scared. I could barely speak to the dispatcher on the phone. But after about 5 minutes, I began to hear a faint sound of police sirens in the distance. I checked the door camera again, and he was still there. But now he was sitting on the floor, cross-legged, as if he was just patiently waiting for me to come out. Well, as the sirens became louder, I noticed the red and blue lights emanating through the windows, followed by the slamming of a car door. I then heard muffled speech as if there was a conversation taking place. I checked the live feed from my camera again, and saw the man talking to the police, as if everything was normal, and I was so confused. Seeing that there were now 2 policemen outside my apartment, I built up the courage to open the door and confront this strange man. When I opened the door, he instantly turned his head and stared directly at me with that same big smile, and he started to walk towards me. One of the policemen told him to step back, but he didn't listen as his pace started to increase. The second policeman pulled out a gun and ordered the man a second time to stop, or he would be shot. But this still didn't seem to faze him. The look on this man's face was one of nightmares, and as he got closer, I could feel myself weak at the knees, almost as if I was frozen to the spot. Then suddenly, the first policeman quickly jumped behind the man and tackled him to the ground, They arrested him that night, due to ignoring their orders, but he was only taken down to the police station where he refused to talk the entire time. Apparently he lived somewhere in the apartment complex, so technically this man had every right to be there, and therefore there was nothing the police could do. They never managed to find out why he was outside my door, or if he was the one stealing my packages. But they did tell me he'd been previously arrested for assault on an elderly lady a few years before, and actually served time in prison. So it's safe to say, things could have gone very differently if the police didn't show up that night. Luckily, I never saw him again, and no more packages went missing, thank God. But I ended up moving to a new apartment a few months later, as the police statement helped me convince my landlord to let me out of my contract early. But to this day, I still check my peephole before bed every single night, just to make sure that he's not there. I never thought it would happen to me. I always heard stories of creepy neighbours and stalkers, but I never thought I would have one myself. It started innocently enough, with just the occasional glance from across the street or at the supermarket. But then it became clear that I was being followed. At first I tried to ignore it, thinking maybe I was just being paranoid. But then I started seeing him more and more, always staring at me with a blank expression. I heard from other neighbours that he was mentally disabled and still lived with his mother, which made me feel guilty for even thinking of reporting him. But one day, I'd had enough. I got into my car and started driving, only to see him in my rear-view mirror. I pulled over and demanded that he get out, which he did, sprinting off down the street. I felt a sense of power and relief, thinking that maybe I'd scared him off for good. But I decided to confront his mother to tell her about what he had done, and she apologised and appeared visibly horrified when I told her about the car incident. To be honest, I felt bad for her, and could imagine the stress that she must be under every day looking after him, so I tried to let it go. But the next week, I saw him once again at the supermarket. This time, I decided to confront him directly, and demanded that he leave me alone. His face turned bright red and filled with anger, and his breathing became heavier. I started to get frightened, so I quickly went to pay for my shopping and leave. But as I stood there in the queue, the cashier asked if the man behind me was with me. I turned around to see what she was talking about, and there he was, standing directly behind me, with a crazed look on his face. I screamed, and the cashier instantly called for help. The manager rushed over and ordered the man to leave the supermarket at once, but he wasn't moving. Eventually they had no choice but to call the police, who had to physically pick him up and force him out of the store. I was so shaken up by the incident, but the police promised to handle the situation. They gave him a final warning that if he was seen stalking me or any other people, he would be sent back to the psychiatric facility. Well, after that day, I never saw him again. But the memory of his crazed expression and that intense fixation he had on me will haunt me for a very long time. Living in a quiet suburban neighbourhood, I thought I had hit the jackpot when I moved into my new house. Everything was perfect at first. The garden was huge, the neighbours were nice, and the best part, it was only a short drive away from my work, which meant I now got to sleep an extra hour every day. But my enthusiasm all came crashing down when I officially met my other next-door neighbour, Mrs. Jenkins. She was an elderly woman who usually kept to herself, but we would sometimes exchange a smile or a wave every now and then. But soon I started to notice strange things happening around her house. Every night the same noises would come from her backyard. It sounded like someone was digging, but every time I looked outside, there was nothing there. I tried to ignore it, but the noises continued, getting louder and more frequent. One day I decided to take a closer look. I went into my garden and I climbed onto a ladder to peek over the fence, and what I saw left me feeling more than uneasy. Mrs. Jenkins was digging in her garden, but it wasn't the kind of gardening I was used to. She was burying something that was almost twice her size. I tried to dismiss it as just my imagination. I mean, how could this frail old lady be able to even carry a dead body, let alone dig a hole big enough to bury it? But nonetheless, the feeling of unease lingered, and then things started to get even creepier. Every time I went outside, Mrs. Jenkins was there, watching me. She would just stand there, staring at me with a cold, dead expression. It was like she was trying to communicate something, but I couldn't quite understand what it was. I even woke up one morning to find Mrs. Jenkins standing outside my bedroom window. Her face was pressed up against the glass, and she was staring at me with those same dead eyes. This had been escalating for the past few weeks now, so I was really starting to get paranoid. I couldn't take it anymore, so I went to the police, but they just brushed it off, saying that I was just over-exaggerating, and that technically she hadn't done anything illegal, so what were they supposed to do? But I knew that something was wrong. I started to keep a journal of all of the strange occurrences, hoping that it would help me make sense of things. I remember I went into my backyard one day to find my ladder had broken in half. It was strange because we hadn't had any storms for a while, and the last place I put my ladder was lying down at the back of my garden. So this confirmed that there was definitely something wrong. But I still had no physical proof that this was in fact Mrs. Jenkins. So there was nothing I could do. I've now been living here for a number of years, and I haven't spoken to Mrs. Jenkins again since. We bump into each other every once in a while, but there is no smile or wave anymore. Just a mutual dislike for each other. I do worry that she will try something again, but for now, I can only hope that her old age will soon catch up with her. I had just moved to the countryside to a quiet farm on the outskirts of a small town. My wife and I were so excited to start our new life, away from the hustle and bustle of the city. But little did we know that our new neighbour, the owner of the farm next door, would turn out to be a very unfortunate presence in our lives. At first, everything seemed fine enough. We had a few animals on our farm, a few cows, some chickens, and a small flock of sheep. But every now and then, we'd find that some of our sheep had wandered onto our neighbour's land. I didn't think too much of it at first. Maybe they were just curious and liked to explore. But then, one day our neighbour came over to our farm to complain. He was a very moody and unfriendly man, and we instantly took a disliking to him. He accused us of letting our sheep wander onto his land on purpose, to eat his crops and destroy his property. I apologised and promised to fix any holes in the fence that might be allowing the sheep to escape. But the complaints just kept on coming, even after I patched up the fence. I couldn't understand why our neighbour seemed so angry about a few sheep, but I tried to be as polite as possible whenever he came around. But as the weeks went by, things started to get weirder. Our neighbour would come over to our farm in the middle of the night, pounding on our door and demanding to speak to me. He claimed that our animals were causing more damage to his property, even though there was absolutely no evidence for this. He seemed to be fixated on the sheep in particular, always asking how many we had and where they were grazing. I started to get a really bad feeling about him. He was always scowling and never seemed to smile or show any kind of positive emotion. And then, one morning, I went out to the field to feed the sheep as usual, and found that 5 of them had been slaughtered in the night. I called the police immediately, but there was no evidence to suggest that our neighbour was the one who was responsible. He denied any involvement, of course, and there was no way to prove that he had done it, but I knew in my gut that he was the one who had killed my animals. After that, our neighbour stopped coming around to complain, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching us, still keeping an eye on our farm. I avoided him as much as possible, but every time I looked out to his farm, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. I remember I woke up one night to the sound of sheep bleating. I got out of bed and looked out the window, and I saw something that chilled me to the bone. Our neighbour was standing in the field between our farms, holding one of our sheep by the neck. He was staring right at me, with a twisted smile on his face. I called the police again, but by the time they arrived, our neighbour was already gone and my sheep was back with the rest of the flock. They searched his property, but they didn't find anything incriminating, and so we had no choice but to continue living in fear with a possible psychopath living next door. To this day, I still don't know what his true motives were, or why he was so obsessed with our animals. But I haven't spotted him in our farm since, so I can only hope that the second police call scared him off for good. We had just moved to a new town and found a lovely home to rent. It was perfect for our family, spacious, cosy, and in a quiet neighbourhood. But from the very first day, I had this sense that we were being watched. The old man next door would always be standing at his window, staring at us as we pulled up into the driveway. It was so unnerving. We would catch him watching us every time we left the house or came back home. It didn't even matter what time of day it was. He would always be there, peering out of his window. At first I tried to ignore it. Maybe he was just curious about his new neighbours. But as the days went by, it became clear that he was watching our every move. Whenever we were outside, he would stand by his window and glare. It was creepy and made me feel so uncomfortable. I decided to talk to him and ask if everything was okay, but he just stared blankly at me and closed his door without saying a word. It was as if he didn't want to be bothered, and that he found pleasure in silently watching us. Even my kids began to feel scared and wouldn't want to play outside, knowing he was always there. We started to feel like prisoners in our own home, never able to relax or be comfortable. One night I couldn't take it anymore. I looked outside and there he was again, standing in the dark. Eventually we decided that we needed to move. We were all just so uncomfortable, and of course there was nothing we can do, as all he was doing was watching us. And as far as I'm aware, that's not a criminal offence. We couldn't just continue living our lives constantly looking over our shoulders, wondering if he was there. It was such an unsettling feeling, and one that we couldn't shake. We moved out the following week, and I never saw him again. I don't know if he was truly dangerous or just an old man with too much time on his hands, but I'm just so glad that we no longer live in that house. When the new couple moved in down the street, I couldn't help but notice how strange they were. They never waved back when I said hello, and they always seemed to be up late at night. There was a strange energy emanating from their house that made everybody down the street feel uneasy. At first I thought maybe they were just night owls, or perhaps they worked really odd hours. But then I noticed something else that made me even more suspicious. Every night around 3 a.m, they would come out of their house and dump their trash into the bins outside. It was an odd time to be taking out the garbage, and I couldn't help but wonder what they were doing up so late. The more I observed them, the more I realized how little I actually knew about them. They never had any visitors, and they never left the house during the day. And yet there was always a light on somewhere inside, no matter what time of day or night it was. One day I decided to confront them. I went over to their house and rang the doorbell, but no one answered. I could hear movement inside, but they didn't come to the door. It was as if they were purposely avoiding me. That's when I started to get really worried. What kind of people were they, and what were they doing in that house? The more I thought about it, the more my mind started to race with possibilities. I decided to stay up late and watch their house. I wanted to see if I could catch a glimpse of what they were up to. As I watched from across the street, I noticed something strange. Their windows were all covered with blackout curtains, so I couldn't see inside. But I could hear weird noises coming from their house, scratching and thumping, and other unidentifiable sounds. I stayed up for hours, waiting to see if anything would happen. But nothing did. Finally, around 2 a.m, I decided to give up and go to bed. But as I climbed into bed, I suddenly heard a strange sound coming from outside, like something scratching at my window. I bolted upright in bed and looked outside, but I didn't see anything. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease that had settled over me, but it was no use. The strange behaviour of my neighbours had clearly gotten under my skin. In the end, they only lived here for less than a year before they eventually moved away. I never found out what they were doing, but I spoke to the other neighbours and nobody is really sure. Some say they were involved in human trafficking or drug dealing, but it could just be that they were an odd couple that liked their privacy. But who knows what they were really up to. Either way, I certainly feel a lot safer now, knowing they're no longer living in my neighbourhood. I had just moved into a new apartment complex and was excited to start my new life. Everything seemed perfect, except for my neighbour, Mr. Wilson, or as he preferred to be called, Jeffy. Every time I stepped into the lift, he was there, with a big smile on his face. He would always greet me with a friendly, "Good morning," or "How are you today?" At first, I was happy to have a friendly neighbour. I would chat with him on our short elevator rides and we would laugh at silly jokes. But as the days went on, he seemed to be in the lift almost every single time that I was, and it started to feel strange. He would always ask me personal questions about my life too, and it made me feel uncomfortable. So eventually I started to avoid him any way I could, but it was almost impossible. He would always be there, waiting for me. One day I mustered up the courage to confront him about this. "Why are you always in the lift when I am?" I asked with a jokey tone, trying not to make the conversation too uncomfortable. But he just smiled and said that it was a pleasant coincidence, and he was unsure why, but grateful to spend time with me nonetheless. This response made me feel extremely uneasy, but I decided to give him the benefit of the doubt, as I'm usually not one to judge. But the next day I stepped into the lift, and of course he was there again. This time we laughed about how we kept running into each other, but as the days went on, he became more and more aggressive. He would sometimes touch my arm or shoulder while we were talking, and it made me feel even more uncomfortable. But then, everything suddenly became clear one night, when I heard a strange buzzing noise coming from my bedroom. I investigated, and after a long search, I found a small camera in one of my electric sockets. It was then that I realised that Mr. Wilson had been watching me the whole time. I felt so violated and scared. I reported him to the building management and the police, but other than removing the device and investigating the footage, there was nothing they could do to prove that it was in fact my neighbour. I pleaded with them, saying that someone must be breaking in, so they advised me to change the locks, which I did. After that day, I never bumped into Mr. Wilson again. Maybe he tried to break in one night and found that the locks had changed. Or maybe the camera was just left from the previous tenant, and nobody had been monitoring the footage. But either way, I never felt comfortable in that apartment again. And as soon as my contract expired, I moved to the other side of town to be as far away as possible, but still within commuting distance for my job. To this day, I have never been as petrified as I was the day I found that camera. Thank you for watching, and if you prefer the longer format videos, please let me know in the comments down below, and make sure to subscribe for more scary stories.